when we met to talk about this, we felt that the social sciences probably have a lot to say about goodness. But we weren't so sure about the natural sciences initially. And Dr. Gray will talk a lot more about that. So in some ways, we need to adjust the title slightly to say what can the natural sciences say about goodness, because other sciences can say quite different things than we can. But we're happy that you came today, because the quick answer to this question is that we often assume that the natural sciences don't have anything to say about goodness. So reflecting that in our title, we thought, well, at least we can tell you what 3 natural scientists think about goodness. So I'm going to start by talking about 3 ideas I have for how we might define goodness in our fields, and then we'll go into more specifics with Dr. Gray and Baird. So this is part of the long, multi-semester extravaganza about the founding principles of this university, which are truth, beauty, and goodness. And so I thought because those three are interrelated, I thought I'd take a quick look at how the natural sciences view these concepts first. At the introductory session in this series, Brian, I believe it was, quoted a 17th century critic of poetry. Was that you? And the idea of this critic was that a poet takes a true sentence, a true statement, and has to sort of untruthify it to make it poetic. And his idea was that truth and beauty in poetry are pretty much diametrically opposed. Poets are on the side of beauty, therefore they're anti-truth, therefore writing poetry is sort of an immoral act. Was essentially the idea of that one kind of extremist view. But it turns out that the difficulty with nailing down truth and beauty simultaneously is actually fairly common. I found a quote by W.H. Auden about art and how art arises out of our desire to have both beauty and truth. But we also have the knowledge that they're not identical, and in that gap, that's what drives people to make art. And I think that natural sciences have a similar problem. So let's start by taking a look at how natural sciences look at ideas of truth and beauty and to look at the gap between them, and then we'll see how goodness fits into that. All right, so natural scientists actually don't deal with truth. I would say that we know when a theory is untrue, but we don't actually claim to know when a theory is true. We only claim that a theory is successful or not successful. And that means, does the theory describe the data set that we have? If it does, then we'll go with it for a while. If it does not, it gets discarded. And we especially are interested in theories that are true enough or successful enough that they allow us to make predictions of something that's going to happen, or some experimental results that we haven't got yet. Beauty in chemistry is lacking. Now, biology and environmental science and physics deal with very beautiful phenomena, but I gotta say, chemistry in terms of visual beauty is almost completely out of it. So, there's a journal called Chemical and Engineering News, and they have a regular feature about chemistry photography, trying to find some beautiful thing that came out of a lab, and it's almost a complete failure every time. So this is like the most beautiful picture of chemicals that I could find on the internet. These are all colorless chemicals, and somebody stuck little colored LEDs to, try to get some kind of visual interest, but total disaster. So I'm not even going to talk about visual beauty. When scientists talk about beauty, it's often a code for mathematical elegance. And I was at a conference in September, and a speaker came up and he was talking about the beauty of aerosol science. And he flashed up on the screen a double integral. Wow, I actually can't relate to that either. But that's one definition of beauty, that we like things that can be described well by mathematics. But there's a few other things that make a beautiful theory, and those are if it's conceptually simple, we like that. And also if it has a compelling narrative, if it's easy to understand and easy to remember. I think humans have a natural preference for those kinds of theories. All right, so goodness now perhaps is somewhere in between these two. And one idea I had for how to define goodness is that goodness allows us to try to navigate the maze between these two poles that are attracting scientists. So, for example, in curriculum, in our freshman classes, I invited my freshmen to come to this talk, but of course they didn't come. We favor conceptual simplicity and compelling narratives as we teach. However, if you major in chemistry or biochemistry, we then have to bring you back in 2 years later and basically unlearn with you what we told you as freshmen, because at that point we need a higher level of empirical accuracy, and the concepts that we taught as freshmen, as first year students, although they're very powerful, they don't have the level of accuracy that we need. So then we have to start attaching correction factors like barnacles on this theory, which really makes it ugly, right? So there's clearly some level of difficulty between these two. Another example of that is if you think about scientists who are overly attracted to the compelling narrative. There's a story that they want to tell with their data. Perhaps their data isn't telling that story. Okay? Leaving truth behind and sliding too far down to beauty can actually lead people to falsify data and create fraudulent science. So there's definitely a gap between beauty and truth in science, depending on how finely detailed you need your accuracy to be. All right, so that's idea one, is that goodness allows us to try to navigate between these two attractors. All right. Idea two for what goodness means in natural science. This came from, well, let's put the word good and science together and think about good science. What is good science? So, well, one way to define that is, well, good science wins Nobel Prizes, right? What kind of science, gets a prize like this? And we often focus on the really exciting results that bust paradigms, cause old ideas to get thrown out, unexpected, surprising. So that's definitely good science. Those are the kinds of experiments we tell our students about. But this definition of good, in terms of good science, kind of equates goodness with whatever causes science to move ahead as quickly as possible. And if you follow this road, you end up with good being something that causes change, and even good is results that are disorienting or even disruptive or even annoying to the rest of the population. A great discovery could be exciting for the people in the lab who are making that discovery, but to every other person on the earth, it could be annoying because it may require them to change how they think, and we really don't want to do that. So it's good science, but this is really not a good general idea of goodness, I would say. So my idea number three was to try to contrast good science with some kind of opposite. And I would submit to you that the opposite of good science is not bad science, but it's actually mad science. Right? And I put Frankenstein up here because the Frankenstein novel was published 200 years ago, January 1, 1818. So it's a good time to celebrate Frankenstein this year. But Frankenstein has been resonating culturally in the Western world for now 2 full centuries. And I think we have some idea of the types of things that cause science to be categorized as either mad or good science. So one example is that mad science is done for private benefit, whereas good science is for public benefit. Good science is considered to be problem solving as opposed to problem creating or monster creating. Good science is also accessible as opposed to secretive, understandable as opposed to obscure, and also efficient as opposed to wasteful. So these categories are fairly clear, but what we find is that a given scientific effort may get categorized different ways by different observers. So a lot of these categories are quite objective. The first case, public benefit or private benefit, that today may depend on who you're working for if you're a scientist. If you work in private industry, you may be on the private benefit side. If you work for the government, your work may benefit either the public or the military. If you're in academia, the choice is now yours, what kind of problem you're going to work on. The middle three, though, problem solving, accessible, and understandable, the perception of those categories can depend quite strongly on your science literacy, your level of education. If you know something about science, then other science becomes more accessible and understandable. And people who are literate in science also tend to look at the risks of science a little bit differently. So the same project can look like mad science to one person and good science to another. I would say only this last category is one that can be objectively measured, and in chemistry is routinely measured. So to conclude this part of the panel, I just want to mention that people tend to agree on these categories, which are basically moral categories or ethical categories, but there's rarely perfect agreement on how to categorize individual projects as one way or the other. All right, so with that, we'll go to Sarah Gray.
All right, so what can science tell us about goodness? I'm an earth scientist, so I started out in, as David mentioned, this whole series explores truth, beauty, and goodness, and it was really a lot of fun to be able to kind of think about some of these topics. when I first kind of got cornered at a Drinks with the Dean to do this with a glass of wine in my hand, and I said, okay, I started thinking about it, and I realized that actually for me, initially on the surface, the concept of what can sciences tell us about truth and beauty seemed a little bit more natural and accessible to me. In fact, I attended the last panel last year on scientific perspectives on beauty and was really inspired by it. But the notion of science and goodness just was really kind of hard and challenging for me. And I think my first reaction was, what? Science is supposed to be objective. Isn't it separate from human values? Science helps us to describe what the world is, but cannot evaluate what's good or bad. And so that's how I was first struggling with this. And after all, so I decided to kind of go back to fundamental principles and ask myself what science is. And that's actually kind of good for a scientist to do every once in a while. We think about scientists as working in a lab, but actually science can describe a broad array of human endeavors. And people doing science do it in a variety of different environments, in a variety of different ways. In fact, in the purest sense, children playing at the beach may actually be doing science because they're engaging in kind of study and questioning and gathering evidence about the natural world. So science can kind of break down into two aspects. The first aspect is that science is a process of inquiry to learn about the natural world. And David got into a little bit more details about how that process works. And science is also an ever-building, creative, cumulative body of knowledge. This body of knowledge advances, and science builds on the work of a community of science. If you look at any scientific idea, usually going back to the core of the idea, you go back multiple generations in the work of previous scientists. The cool thing about it is that new questions are always generated, so science is self-perpetuating. So what I wanted to do was to break up these two aspects of science and look at them. David has already talked a little bit about the scientific method, and it's sort of the classic method of doing science that we learn about in school, sort of the empirical testing, curiosity-driven observation of nature. But one of the fundamental premises of this, and I borrowed the next couple of slides, they were modified from our diversity postdoc, Dr. Marlene Brito-Milan, who talked about objectivity in science. The fundamental premise is that science is supposed to be objective. And it's vital when we're doing science to try and distance our preconceived notions and biases from the science that we're doing. And we have a lot of techniques to be able to do that. We can do double-blind experiments, random sampling, and of course the whole process of scientific replication by independent research helps ensure that we can maintain some of this objectivity. So this objectivity really implies that science is neutral, but as David brought up when he talked about mad science, we know that there are many aspects of science that are non-neutral. The first thing is, who is doing science? Who are they working with? What are the inherent biases and motivations? What is the culture that you bring to science? What is your education that affects your perception and the lens at which you're looking at the world? Where are you doing science? We do science in institutions. David mentioned the difference between an academic and an industry scientist. Who benefits? Who's harmed? How will this knowledge be used? These are all questions that affect the objectivity of science. And what's really important, because as many of us know who deal with budgets in the sciences, science can be really expensive, so you need funding. So the funding also can affect the objectivity of science. And in fact, speaking of science, one of the primary funders of science in the United States is, of course, the National Science Foundation. And if you look at the mission of the foundation, it really connects to this concept of science being for the common good, or for the public good. The mission of the NSF is to promote the progress of science, to advance the national health, prosperity, welfare, and to secure the national defense, and they add, and for other purposes. But if you look at that, and of course the underlines and the colors were added by me, you see a number of words that really resonate with the whole notion of goodness, and that goodness is really why we're funding science and why we're driving science. However, recently there's even been a greater push to try and fund research only in, quote, the national interest. For example, in 2016, Lamar Smith in the House proposed and passed a bill called the Scientific Research in the National Interest Act, which the purpose was to ensure that what was to request that all call for proposals and the NSF identified specific elements of in which the science connected to the national interest. And they define the national interest as being related to economic benefit, scientific workforce, and also partnerships with industry. So one of the problems is that defining science for the national interest or the public good is you have to worry about whose perception of the good public good there is. And some of the critics, and one of the problems with this is that this actually undermines the whole notion that the whole notion of sort of an unfettered scientific investigation. All right, so the whole concept of science for the common good was exemplified in the March for Science, where millions of people across the country marched for science on Earth Day in 2018 and 2017. And again, if you look at the mission from the website of the March for Science, you again see many words that resonate goodness. The March for Science champions robustly funded and publicly communicated science as a pillar of human freedom and prosperity. We call for science that upholds, again, the common good, and for political leaders and policymakers to enact evidence-based policies in the public interest. So what we can see here also in the signs of many of the marchers is this whole notion that science is good. But there were some prominent critics of the March for Science coming from some prominent scientists who thought that the March for Science potentially politicized science, and that it projected science as science as driven by ideology rather than evidence. The notion of whether or not science should be political and whether or not scientists should advocate for political change is one that's been a hot topic of a discussion across the scientific community, particularly around important issues such as climate change recently. So going back to fundamental, but the other argument is, of course, science has always been political. All you need to do is go back to Darwin and Galileo to see multiple examples. So going back to the original question then, science as a process of inquiry. If science is purely objective, I don't really see a strong connection with goodness. It's not good or bad. But in reality, because of all these factors, it seems like science cannot be perfectly objective, and thus it is related to goodness. So thinking about the second aspect of science, that science is an ever building cumulative body of knowledge, we can actually think about how the world has changed due to science. Science has actually made the modern world what it is. If we compare life today to what it was like, for example, in the Middle Ages, we can identify that there's been unparalleled increase in prosperity and wealth, at least for a fraction of society, maybe not for everyone. Some of the technologies that have arisen from this body of knowledge have completely changed the way we live and work. And of course, there have been benefits to human health and lifespan. And there are countless examples across many scientific disciplines. I think we might hear more about that in this panel. In my field, in earth and environmental science, one example of the goodness of the body of scientific knowledge comes from natural disaster prediction and response. If we look at the great Galveston earthquake of 1900, which killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people, we look at where we've come since then, there have been dramatic improvements in hurricane forecasting. In fact, just in the last 8 years, the cone of uncertainty, or the hurricane track, has improved 36%. So science continues to advance, and this has saved property and millions of dollars. But is it all good? Is all of this good? Of course, with all of this, we get, it looks like one of my slides. Of course, with all of this, there are many downsides. Pollution, nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, people's isolation from nature, maybe isolation from the community. Of course, environmental destruction, loss of habitat. There are many countless examples of the detriment of how aspects of this scientific knowledge have been bad. We know that there are winners and losers, and there are always unintended consequences. In earth and environmental science, we can also look at the benefits of resource exploration. And here in San Diego, we actually are living in a harsh environment that really only has enough water resources for between 10,000 and 20,000 people. So the increase in population in the Southwest that has occurred during the 20th century is largely due to developments in hydrology that have brought new water resources and energy that have fueled air conditioning and other technologies. So one example of some of the unintended consequences and environmental winners and losers, as well as the interconnectedness between water resources, is the Salton Sea. And I take my students to the Salton Sea every year, and we look at the science that governs the relationship between humans and their environment. The Salton Sea is a below sea level man-made lake. It was created by a major mistake of the Army Corps of Engineers in 1905 when they bungled a diversion of the Colorado River water. But today it is a really, really important habitat for millions of migratory birds along the Pacific Flyway who have lost much of their wetland habitat. You probably didn't realize it, but when you flushed the toilet today, you actually impacted the birds of the Salton Sea and also air quality in the Imperial Valley. Because of the need for water diversions from the Salton Sea, the lake level has retreated, increasing the salinity and exposing toxic sediment to wind-blown dust. So here we see some of our students that went out to the Salton Sea last semester and measured salinity levels greater than almost twice what marine salinity levels are. So what has been good for the people in San Diego and Southern California and has allowed us to water our lawns and enjoy the life here has actually been bad for the birds and the habitat and the wildlife in the Salton Sea, and also the air quality in the Imperial Valley. But this is another story for another day. So when it comes to the body of knowledge of science and whether or not it's good or not, we need to think about this body of knowledge as not just being utilitarian. Like religion or art or literature, science provides us with a new perspective on our place in the cosmos, our place in time, in the vastness of geologic time, and a better understanding of ourselves as human beings. So at a deeper level, it is at the core, it's at the core a creative process. And so therefore it's kind of at the center, I would argue, central to the humanities. And from this, I have come to the conclusion that there is goodness in science, and that science does connect with goodness.
So the title of this series is The Idea of Goodness. And when we got together before Thanksgiving to talk, we realized that ideas and reality, or perceptions of reality, might not always align. And as Dr. Gray suggested, while we would like to consider ourselves objective about our work, and that what we do is doing good for humanity or the knowledge of science or whomever, that is not always the way our work might be perceived outside of the scientific community, outside of the university, especially in certain areas where certain technologies that are part of science have been applied. So I would like to spend a few minutes today talking about a technology that, interestingly, as I said, we discussed before Thanksgiving, and in the past few days has become much more relevant than it was at that point. But it's a technique that has reached deeply both into the scientific community, causing lots of advancement as well as lots of discussion, and it has generated enormous popular debate. And those of you who are nodding know that I'm talking about some of the technology associated with genetic engineering, which is responsible for lots of new developments in science that have occurred in the past few years. Now, let me be clear. Agriculturalists and breeders have been mixing DNA for centuries by, as Darwin explained to us, selecting characteristics of plants or animals that we as humans felt were good, and crossing those organisms to provide us better food, better animals. Again, we assumed that they were better. And this current technology acts upon that same basis or foundation. It just speeds it up. For those of you who aren't familiar with aspects of genetic engineering, let me give you just a snapshot. It's been around not even 50 years. In 1972, after a tabletop discussion in a bar in Waikiki, two scientists at Stanford got together and were able to insert DNA into a bacterium and express a gene for antibiotic resistance to an antibiotic that's commonly used as a marker in the laboratory. None of those pieces were novel, but putting them together was. It was a cool discovery. It supported a lot of the early suppositions about the continuity of genetic material. The availability of it to be manipulated was something that at that time was likened to the discovery of fire. It could be used to heat a house. It could be also used to burn down a house. So both benefits and dangers were inherent and were realized to be inherent in this powerful tool of science. In subsequent years, scientists held meetings to try to form regulations, and nobody could quite agree on those regulations. Despite that, the discoveries continued and things continued to be built upon this technology. The first genetically engineered mouse was developed in 1974, and a genetically engineered plant was reported in 1983. And for the first time around that time, we saw DNA actually being patented. So today, because I'm a plant scientist, as Brian said in the beginning, I'm going to focus on some of the work that's been done in plants. And many of you may remember, well, actually looking at the audience, some of you may remember that the first genetically engineered organism piloted outside the lab was not a plant, but a bacterium made to be used on a plant. The organism was tested in 1983 and was called frostban. It was a strain of bacterium that is commonly found on plant leaves. And let me tell you just a little bit about bacteria that live on plant leaves. They have a protein in the outer surface that when there is a frost in springtime can cause ice to nucleate and form a coating of ice on the surface of the leaf, thereby damaging the plant. It's estimated that in the United States, frost damage costs farmers somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion a year. So there's an economic issue there. So what the engineered organism had done was that protein, the information from for that protein in the genome was removed. And so the frostban organism was called an ice minus strain. And when it's sprayed on plant leaves, it was in the laboratory competing with the naturally occurring bacterium and actually slightly outcompeting it. It prevented frost formation in things like strawberries and peaches and almonds, very important crops certainly here in California and elsewhere in the United States. And so the goal was to minimize frost damage, to save agriculturalists time and money. Well, the testing of this not only brought all sorts of scientific excitement, it brought the first widespread public outcry against this new technology. The fields were attacked, plants were destroyed, the tests still went on, but all of a sudden we had the first vision of somebody looking at this new technology and saying, we're not sure this is good. And so clearly it was not the sort of thing that generated excitement in a widespread area outside the scientific community. Interestingly enough, frostban was never used commercially, but it sort of set the stage. It did set the stage for many genetically engineered crop products, including crops that were resistant to herbicides, insects, those with higher protein content and higher productivity. The promises that were made as a result of this basic research were the ability to develop farming to be able to feed more people in both developed and developing countries. Skeptics, though, worried, what about consuming these plants? What's it going to do to people? What about that material in the environment? And even some biologists that were involved in developing these engineered crops wondered, what would this introduced material do to naturally occurring plant material that might be native to a particular area? So the science facts and the science suppositions swirled, and in 1997, the European Union required labeling of any genetically engineered organism or product of a genetically engineered organism. The United States and other countries have been much slower to accede to this, and so there's still a motley series of regulations, some almost 50 years later, associated with this technology. But what are some of the numbers? Is this stuff out there? Is it real, except in the laboratory? It's estimated that in the United States, and some of these numbers might shock you, 93% of our corn and soybeans are genetically modified. Of that genetically modified corn, some of it goes to feed, but a lot of it goes to high fructose corn syrup. So those of you that looked at your labels and see high fructose corn syrup, you might be worried about the corn syrup itself. You might not have thought about where that corn came from. More than half of the sugar in the United States comes from sugar beets. You might think it comes from cane, but no, it's sugar beets. 90% of the sugar beet crop in the United States is genetically modified. So chances are, if you've had sugar recently, you might have had some genetically modified sugar. So why genetically alter crops? If people are concerned, why is there still a push to introduce these? There have been several different studies, and one of the ones that is probably the most complete was published in 2014 by Klumper and his colleagues, where he did a meta-analysis of data on agriculture associated with genetically modified crops. Worldwide, only about a third of the corn crop is genetically modified, but when you compare that to traditionally raised corn, it requires 37% less pesticide. Pesticides are definitely an issue from a scientific perspective. The yield in some places is increased by as much as 22% in genetically modified corn, and farm profits in some areas are increased by as much as 60%. The beneficial effects in developing countries far outweigh and are much more pronounced than those in developed ones. So, with hunger and poverty being a very real problem that I think everybody can agree are not good things, is the introduction of genetically engineered farm crops a good thing or not? And again, I think it depends on your particular perspective, and as David intimated at the very beginning, what your knowledge and background and science literacy are. I want to conclude here with just a couple of ideas. I focused on agriculture because many of you are familiar with genetically modified agricultural products. For about 30 years, though, people have been working on genetically engineering plants, including lettuce and potatoes, to contain vaccines against various diseases. These plants would be consumed by people in developing countries where refrigeration and access to vaccines is a problem and diseases are widespread. There are still some problems. These vaccines have been tested on people. There are still some problems with providing them in an economical, timely manner, but it's very probable that these might offer some good in the future. And engineering of plants to produce human insulin for diabetics is already something that we are capable of doing. You might say, why do we even want to do that? It is very cost effective. And for people who have religious or personal dilemmas about consumption of pork or cow products, it's a very beneficial alternative. The list could go on in terms of other things that could be modified that many in the scientific community think contribute good, but the jury on that is still out. So what does all this, in terms of what Dr. Haan and Dr. Gray and I have talked to you, tell us that science tells us about goodness? Our mandate in science is to advance. Hopefully, as Dr. Gray says, whether we're funded by the NSF or not, to do good. But as my colleagues and I discovered when we were putting together ideas, what is good is not an easy answer. Who gets to decide what is good? Whose interpretation of good are we considering? In some cases, I would admit, and I think my colleagues would agree, we as scientists need to do a better job of explaining what we're working on, what it does, and how it fits into our current life. We need to be careful that facts are presented instead of speculations or fears. And in forums like this, and hopefully in much wider forums than this, we need to keep talking and thinking about answers, because the idea and the reality of goodness really does present a conundrum. Thank you.
So what do you know about the babies that were genetically engineered in China?
I thought you would ask us, or somebody would ask about the babies. First of all, as a scientist, I should tell you, there is no peer-reviewed report of that particular development. So all I know is what's written in the popular press, which, as I just suggested, we need to be careful about. What she's referring to is, I think it was reported on Monday, a Chinese scientist self-reported that he had used a technology that is not genetic engineering per se, but genetic editing to edit out or make twin baby girls, I believe, resistant to AIDS. This has been questioned. I don't know anything about the truth of it. I do know that the technology he mentions would allow that to happen potentially. Whether he has actually achieved, I couldn't say. Yes?
Yeah, I myself like science, so this is not a question against science. But it seems to me modernity has a lot to do with specialization. And isolation of various disciplines, right? And we're finally getting to a point where we understand the interrelationship between disciplines. But the way the three of you talk, it almost seems that we need to have a better relationship between the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences, right? Because that's what ultimately makes the relations of goodness in a sense. Because you have a product, both science and technology produces product and produces progress in that sense. But how is used, could it be either used for good or for bad? And sometimes it's hard to tell. As an example, we thought we did good with the atomic bomb at the end of the war, but now we're living under this situation, okay? And other situations, even when you don't intend to do bad, it seems like everything is good. The population's getting better, everybody's getting more mature. There's more people, now suddenly there's an environmental problem, unintended consequences. So it seems to me there has to be a better understanding of how social policies can be informed, but also be instructed to tell what scientists could do, because certain things could be harmful, especially when misused, and particularly when it's driven by money. For instance, the efficiency of making money in the corn, is so efficient. And so their argument is that it feeds a lot of people, but on the other hand, what could result, and it's not driven necessarily by good, that would be the argument, but they just want to make more profit. So therefore, I wonder whether making profit is ultimately the thing to be blamed, at least in part, rather than you guys are being in some ways pawns of a larger system. So I wonder whether you want to say something about that.
I think that concern was motivating the March for Science. Dr. Gray showed, one of their statements about how they wanted policies to be evidence-based and benefiting all people. Because I think, we feel a gap there. That there are things that are known that are not being used to benefit everyone or to inform policy.
Yeah, and I guess I think as a scientist, if you are open and transparent about, and critical and aware of what the motivations are, if you're reading the literature and you're recognizing that funding sources have bearings on the kind of questions that scientists ask, it allows us to interpret the things a little bit more critically.
Yeah.
I think one of the more pressing concerns about the genetic engineering is the way it creates plants and seeds and genomes and turns them into intellectual property that is owned and controlled by corporations. And I wonder if that creates an ethical dilemma that sort of counterbalances some of the advantages that they offer.
It does, and I think that one of the things, and the gentleman back there has also addressed it, that because of where we work, we tend to think of science as university science, and there is the science that's associated with corporations and where profit is an important motive and secrecy is an important piece, and people sign non-disclosure agreements and all this sort of stuff. And so, and as you said, things get patented and they're not available without paying a price. And that is something that I think grew out of science in the last 50 years that we're still trying to come to grips with. But because all of us, like you, came through a university system where things are supposed to be open and ideas shared, and that is quite antithetical to that. And some of that secrecy is probably, I know that certain corporations and their secrecy have led to some of the bad feelings, whether people had a lot of facts behind them. I think just some of the secrecy, you're right, led to suspicion that something bad was going on. Yes?
Hi, I'm so sorry, I got here so late. But it seems to me, I mean, and I feel free to comment, that sometimes we have a question about what will the side effects be, but sometimes people are suffering so badly. I think the only thing we could come up with for a long time was the mosquito nets, and I can't, you know, in Africa, the diseases that people were getting from mosquitoes or probably other insects. But also, we were using what a Dow favorite, you know, spraying it to get rid of them, and that's not so good either. On the other hand, I think sometimes in desperation, you have to go to what can take care of the problem now and continue to look for a benefit. And it is hard to get the treatment and cures to some people in some places, some villages. So we have to go maybe to a less desirable form of treatment in order to at least abate the problem someplace. Would you care to comment? You think? Please. Or did that make sense?
Yeah, I would just generally agree with that there are problems that are urgent enough that you have to act without knowing all the ramifications.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah.
Thanks for putting it in.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, Michelle?
I really like the fact that we're actually having scientists thinking about goodness, because we don't do that often enough. But one of the things that came up, particularly in Sarah's, but in all of yours, was who defines good and goodness. And I'm going to pick on the fact that you use Lamar Smith, which is one of the worst examples of someone defining goodness in science, because he's one of the most anti-scientific. Thank God he's been turned down and he won't be there anymore. But he defined a science group, NSF, scientific goodness, by not being a scientist. So my question to you is, how do we get better at discussing what we as scientists view as goodness? How do we get the scientific literacy that David brought up to not only us, but to the decision makers? So what's your take on sort of passing on our definitions of goodness and our education to the people that are not scientists? Comes back to the social sciences and the other.
I guess I would say that it kind of starts with what we're doing here, which is science literacy. And science literacy is really, really critical at a very fundamental level. I think the push for citizen science now, where you know, we're not thinking of science as this elite process for people with PhDs in universities, but we're actually getting members of the public engaged in science. I think if members of the public understand this relatively simple process of scientific inquiry, it's going to help them to listen to the news and understand scientific results. So I think that's a good starting point.
Sarah mentioned something that I guess I've only been aware of in the past couple of years. I think scientists, especially when there's a sentiment that doubts facts and doubts science. I think scientists need to become more politically active. And I don't think that in general, we've done that as a body of people. We've tended to teach, we work in our lab, but we have not been politically involved and vocal. And I think that through the marches and through interaction, actually going and visiting with people in legislature and various decision-making bodies to inform them, I think that's something we need to do more of. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Keith?
I'd like to postulate that as a tenet of goodness, it's kind of the idea that with privilege comes responsibility. Mm-hmm. I think with the sciences, if you're privileged enough to pursue science at the levels that are being pursued at this university and other places, I think there comes a responsibility to be able to do that, to be able to to translate that and put that out there. But also the responsibility, I think, a basic one, as being the only fully sentient beings on this planet, to be caretakers, to be stewards of the natural science, the natural, and so sometimes when you look at these ideas of what, just look at the NSF mission, it's very human-centric. And I don't mean to say that I don't think science should just be about, everything but humans, but I think that interferes a little bit with the objectivity right there. But it's also a matter of, shouldn't we be thinking about ourselves as stewards because we have a responsibility? I'm just...
Yeah, I think we need to think about future people also. Because our political system allows present people to vote, it doesn't allow the environment to vote, animals can't vote, and future people can't vote, and all those things limit our ability to really do things that benefit like the entire system.
But we can do things that can help affect these who cannot vote.
Mm-hmm. Kristen?
Speaking of future people, as a parent of kids who are going through, science curriculum at, the middle school level right now, what I find out in our school district in East County, which I live like in the blue thumb of then red sea of people, and so I think it's really interesting in the science curriculum where our like middle school science teachers are kind of limited in their ability to teach science because of the political environment. And so, they'll, like a teacher will talk about climate change, but then, parents get all worried, they're being political, they're talking about climate change. So I don't know if you would have a response, or like, speaking of stewards of knowledge, like how do we help science teachers who don't have as much freedom as a faculty at a university does, or maybe know better, but then get tied by PTAs?
That's a good question. I mean, it really comes down to, the school system and giving, maybe moving towards giving teachers more freedom like faculty members have, and an element of academic freedom at that level.
I would suggest that we need to go talk to PTA directly. I mean, basically, we're talking about a scientific literacy. We're in our bubble. Scientific literacy is making sure that all majors that graduate from USD have scientific literacy. And that's our bubble, and it's a good bubble, and I don't disagree with it. But there's a lot of people out there who really don't have a clue, and they're getting it from the wrong perspectives. For example, they had several discussions of climate change in the news, and virtually all major news reports had non-scientists talking about the National Climate Assessment, saying how bad it was and not having a single scientist there to debate that side. So maybe the way to go, because the teachers are going to be somewhat limited, is we need to educate the parents.
Yeah, I have a slightly difficult question that's kind of related to that in a different way. I was impressed by what David said about the gap, but I interpret it slightly differently. Because it seems to me the deepest aspect about science is the unknown. That's what the gap is, right? So I even question objectivity as such, because problem with human beings is that we all operate with a narrative. The storytelling, okay? So you come to the lab as a scientist, you have a narrative as well. Now you counteract that to a certain degree by doubting it and negating it, but it's still a narrative and you pass it on, somebody else has that narrative. How do we overcome this tendency that human beings have, and we definitely need to have a narrative to, in a sense, coalesce some idea together as a thing. So facts, factoids are always not objective, they're always embedded with a narrative, right? And so therefore, if you don't understand that the gap is there, then in a sense, in a true sense, you missed the point, because the narrative has already told you this is a fact, but in fact it isn't, it's moving to something else.
There's a big push in science right now to use artificial intelligence to interpret our data. And one way to interpret that is it's saying, we don't want any of the human narrative requirement. We just want the machine to look at the data and to make the predictions. And as long as it can do that, we'll go with the successful theory model, even though no human can understand it. I find that a little bit worrisome, personally. Yeah, Harriet had a question in the back.
I want to give you kudos for one good thing you did. I'm sure you did more in the community. About, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, I was team teaching a course on international development, and one of the issues that we dealt with was genetically modified organisms. And, one of the, I think she was a biology major, had been in a program set up by, I don't know which department, going to high schools and speaking about genetically modified organisms. Because there's a lot of misapprehension about it, there's a lot of mistaken pseudoscience, etc. And we did this, and I thought this was extremely effective. And I have to say, on the other side, when we did this course, you could never do anything that is absolutely risk-free. And it's always possible that somewhere down the line, this, that, or the other thing will happen. But the preponderance of evidence, it seems to me, is absolutely clear. Genetically modified foodstuffs are great, okay? Given the way the world is organized, and there have been huge deficits because of the reluctance of some people to buy products that are genetically modified. For example, I don't want to go on too long, but the really poignant case was a case in Zambia where they were having a big time famine, but they could not accept grain shipments from the US because if they did, then their supply would be deemed corrupted and they would never be able to sell their products to finicky Europeans who were against it. So this is big time, it's huge impact. Now when I tried to persuade students that this was a decent way to go and that the science was in and so on, I got 3 kinds of hostile responses. One kind of hostile response was a sort of knee-jerk suspicion that it was all big something. Big food, big pharma, big this, big that, big other thing, and we were all being bamboozled without any particular evidence to suggest that it was all that way. The second thing was nature is good. And if we muck around with Mother Nature, then there's a presumption in favor of doing things the natural way. Right? But nature has brought us things like death.
Another body slam right there.
The thing was this pervasive, and this is what I wish you guys could help me do something about. The other thing was a pervasive suspicion of expertise as such. So if scientists can, because a lot hangs on it, can address those 3 issues. One, recognizing that knee-jerk suspicion of big this, big that, and the other thing, while we should pay attention to it, we shouldn't immediately assume it. 2, recognize that experts are autonomously experts, and therefore more likely to get it right than the rest of us. And 3, this whole romantic notion of nature, so I'd love to see y'all do that, but you did good with this program to send students out to talk to the high school students. That was great.
Oh, that's great.
So I have a question. I mean, it strikes me that what makes good science doesn't necessarily make science good.
Yes.
That's true.
Yeah.
And So it seems to me that maybe one way to unpack that a little is that what makes good science is, when we talk about that, we talk about basic science. What makes it robust, what's the data supporting the conclusions, and so on and so forth. What makes science good is a very different animal entirely. It strikes me that that's more in the realm of applied science rather than basic science. And I wonder if you could comment on that distinction in relation to the connection between science and goodness. Is goodness really as the output of science only on the applied side, and is goodness as the input of science only on the basic side?
Well, I think I would argue, and what I was trying to conclude at the end there is that ultimately, when I did this little mini exploration of science and goodness to prepare this talk, what I came up with is that probably the greatest connection between science and goodness was at the level of pure science exploration, basic science exploration that unfettered investigation into our place in the universe without any motivation or any utility. So in a way, if you can take utility away from science, just the process itself is good.
Observation.
Well, but what I'd like to add, and we discussed this a little bit among ourselves, those of us doing basic science who've applied for NSF funding have to do a statement that is critiqued extensively, called the broader impacts. And you can't just say because it's interesting or because nobody's done this before. You have to say why the work you're doing will in some way be good by somebody's interpretation, or you can't even be considered for funding. And so I think even basic science at some level gets critiqued by some people, at least if you're applying for funding, for how good it is in terms of its potential to contribute maybe way down the line by 10 or 20 years to not just advancement of knowledge, but actual benefit of people, productivity, whatever the yardstick is.
I kind of agree with Sarah in one sense. I mean, it's like understanding's objective is to understand. It is good to understand. Beyond the productivity of it, right? And it is our nature to want to understand. So therefore, in a sense, that is a goodness in its own. I agree with that, right? So while you produce an understanding, somebody could misuse it, that's a different question. But I think just understanding it is already good. That's what we're meant to do, is to understand things.
I think as long as we acknowledge our limitations in that, right? Because science, and that's one of the things about, and I think Dave brought this up at the beginning, was that we are limited in what we do understand, and we may be pursuing the unknown, and yet we have to realize we're limited by our tools and our models in that pursuit of science. And I think part of what Ron was getting at is there has to be a discipline to the science. I mean, that's good science. It has to be disciplined science, right? It has to go through all those very definitive pieces to be good science. And so I think goodness of science and what makes science good and what makes science be attached in the long run to goodness, I think is that idea of the pursuit of the unknown, and yet being aware of our limitations in that, and not saying that we know something, but that it helps us predict other things, and that it has, that we, as I like to say, it's not that we have proven something, but that we have not disproven it to the best of our ability.
I think the applied part, and I think, Lisa, you had most of those examples, are human focus. I mean, even the definition was that NSF had. So the GMOs are all about, yes, it's good things for the plant, but it's the plant that's going to be used by the human. Right?
Yes,
Basic
who's it
science
good for?
could be, just working on the plant or the animal or the bacteria or the chemical perspective. And so I think a lot of it comes down to where do we bring the human connection to goodness. If it's goodness for the planet, for scientists, we're okay with that. It doesn't have to necessarily be good for all humans. But I think a lot of the applied work goes to what's my project going to do, and how good is it going to be for the farmer, the fisherman, the
Where is value?
Am I cleaning the pollution up for the fact that the beaches are cleaner, or for the fact that the people can now walk on the beach because the beach?
Well, that was a really stimulating discussion. So it just remains for me to thank the three of you for being with us today. Thank you so much. And do you want to go and watch the tree being lit now? Very interesting.